Hi everybody, welcome along to another episode of the Dispatches podcast. My name is Brendan Malone. It is great to be back with you again. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a shocking case of euthanasia exploitation on a major scale that has just been uncovered in Queensland in Australia and has resulted now in criminal charges being laid. Before we get into that story though, it is great to be back with you again. For those who are my regular followers, you will have noticed that I have been off air for several weeks now. First of all, we had our annual Activate Pro-Life training week that we held here in New Zealand, so I was out of commission during that. And then as soon as I got back home on the Friday evening, I went and watched my kids' school production performance, and I was already starting to feel a little bit crook, a little bit of the flu coming on. And by that night, I was shivering and shaking in bed, and I've had a flu that has really sort of taken me off my feet now for a couple of weeks. After the first week, and I thought I was starting to get over things a bit, on the Saturday evening, Sunday morning, I suddenly developed like a type of vertigo dizziness. I think it's related to fluid in the air, and that took me off my feet for another week, and I'm still on the tail end of that now. It's not as bad, but man, this has been a really, really frustrating experience for me, especially considering that I have not had a cold or flu all season. And hey presto, just as spring hits, I get knocked off my feet. So apologies, please bear with me, but it is great to be back with you again. So let's jump into today's topic of conversation, this shocking case of euthanasia exploitation in Queensland, Australia. Let's read now about this particular incident. Police have uncovered an alleged end-of-life business believed to be linked to as many as 20 deaths, with investigations across 3 states after a man died from a veterinary euthanasia drug. Queensland police have charged a Gold Coast man alleged to have operated the business, Brett Daniel Taylor, with 2 counts of aiding suicide and several drug offences, including trafficking dangerous drugs. The alleged conduct involves deliberately targeting vulnerable people and exploiting them in their most desperate moments, said Detective Inspector Mark Mooney. Taylor, 53, was not a vet, as in a veterinarian, instead allegedly securing access to the drugs through a front charity set up to euthanise whales, which police claim has never carried out any lawful business. When I saw that, I have to say I was kind of surprised that they were able to get away with setting up a charity with such a questionable purpose. Like, even in Australia, I don't know, maybe there are more whale strandings than I'm aware of, but it seems like a little bit of a strange business that should have attracted perhaps some attention earlier on. Police said they were investigating deaths dating back to 2021 and expected the business had allegedly played a role in 20 or more deaths, including some outside Queensland's southeast. The business's services allegedly included helping people die in their own homes, providing them suicide kits, arranging wills, and finding people after their death, Mooney said. So I guess that means going to the place where the person's carried out the act and actually discovering the body, which obviously means that they have been complicit in aiding and abetting in this person's suicide, because they've obviously known in advance that this was going to be happening, and that this had been arranged for them to turn up. Bottles of the euthanasia drug, called pentobarbital, were allegedly found in Taylor's mother's house in Victoria, while police were also investigating in New South Wales. We'll come back to Victoria in just a second, because there's another sort of secondary aspect I want to talk about related to euthanasia in Australia and the sort of shocking nature of what's going on over there. The business allegedly resold the drug for significantly more than its wholesale price, Mooney said. So for those of you who are listening who are thinking maybe this is just some sort of misguided philanthropic sort of mercy that someone was sort of, created a business thinking that they were helping people, and they just have a very misguided sense of what true mercy and what true justice and compassion and care is, and they were helping people to die, thinking that was a good thing. No, according to the police, they were exploiting people. They were selling the drug for a much higher rate, because obviously these people are vulnerable and desperate, and so they probably would have, betted on the fact, and as it turns out probably is the case, that they would be willing to pay significantly more. Also, they are almost certainly targeting a demographic. This is the consistent trend with euthanasia. It tends to be white, wealthy people who are the predominant users of euthanasia. So they are probably targeting a demographic who is willing to actually pay the higher price. We will allege he hasn't acted compassionately at all. This is a business transaction for him, just for pure money. Police began investigating after the death of a 43-year-old man at his home on the Gold Coast in April, in which a post-mortem found had been caused by the veterinary drug. He had suffered from medical conditions for a long period of time, but his medical conditions did not meet the voluntary assisted dying laws of Queensland, Mooney said. So this person was not terminally gravely ill, by the sounds of what the description the police have given here. This is a classic example of what happens with euthanasia, whether it's this kind of exploitation or just in general where you have legalised euthanasia. People take their own lives because they actually lack community and care around them. It's not the condition itself, it's the actual social breakdown around them which drives them towards it. The man and his family are believed to have contacted the business to engage their services, Mooney said. Police charged Taylor with aiding the suicide of that man as well as one other person to whom he allegedly sold the drug. Taylor's 80-year-old father and another woman, aged 81, are alleged to have helped the business's operations and both face charges related to drug trafficking. The woman, who also faces a charge of aiding suicide, was unrelated to Taylor or his father. Police urged anyone who had dealt with a company called End of Life Services to come forward. And again, it's kind of strange. I'd be interested to know what the front charity was, like what that was called that they set up there, because obviously the business name here pretty much gives the whole thing away. Voluntary assisted dying is legal in Queensland, but is strictly regulated, well, not so strictly as we're about to find out, under state law and requires an application to a regulatory body. The maximum penalty for aiding suicide is life in prison. Now let's jump over to another aspect of the story here, and that was the fact that just recently in 2024, in fact, it was almost a year ago, in fact, or just over a year ago, the coroner in Queensland was criticising the woeful state of the legalised euthanasia framework in Queensland. Here's what he had to say. Queensland coroner has labelled the state's euthanasia laws as inadequate, warning that further calamity and heartbreak will be caused if reforms are not made. Coroner David O'Connell said the legislation, which went into effect on the 1st of January 2023, was not a well-considered law, while delivering the findings of his inquiry into a death caused by misuse of voluntary assisted dying drugs. So this is a completely separate case here. He found that the laws were inadequate to provide for medication safety and to prevent deliberate misuse. Further calamity and heartbreak await for parents and families if nothing changes, he said. So this is a warning he gave just over, like approximately 1 year ago, and now we get this new case of exploitation that's come on the back of it. O'Connell said it took just 107 days into the VAD scheme, which is their euthanasia law, for its flaws to be exposed, including a near-total lack of oversight of the key contact person role. So the contact person must be a specific role in the legislation. That's why it is named as such. The contact person, typically a partner, family member or close friend, is responsible for reporting the death of the euthanasia patient and disposing of any unused or remaining substance, which is quite astounding. They literally just have lay people doing this in Australia. Like, there's no state official overseeing or participating in what is quite a key role. Not that I'm pro-euthanasia. I think legalised euthanasia is exactly like, these are the outcomes you get when you legalise euthanasia. You get exploitation, you get wrongful killing. It is not a morally good thing. It's not authentic medicine. It's a failure of care, basically. Effectively, what legalised euthanasia represents is a combination of both liberal autonomy and societal selfishness run amok, because basically you have rich, entitled people who are able to exercise this so-called right without much risk to themselves. So it's legalised effectively for them, and then the rest of the community must suffer the results of their particular liberal autonomy run amok. And it is hugely destructive to healthcare, and then it is also something that brings about great harm. And effectively what it represents is the state, the liberal state, saying, well, look, the best we can offer you is not care, but it's your own death. We'll happily carry it out. Yes, your life is clearly not worth living. We agree with you when you think that about yourself. But not everyone is that in that category. Some people are living lives that are not worth dying, so we won't let them do it. But yes, you're living a life that we think is worth ending, and we will help you to do that. It's an abject failure on so so many levels. But if you're going to legalise it, like these people have done, and then claim it's all safe and, we can do this well, to have a situation where you have a contact person who could just be a lay person who is responsible for reporting the death and disposing of the remaining lethal poisons that are administered to kill the person, yeah, the coroner is sort of on point here. There are simply no checks or inquiries of the contact person's suitability for the position, he said. At the inquest, it was conceded that a person is required to undertake greater identity checks, listen to this, to enter a nightclub in Brisbane than to become a contact person. It is harder for you to get into a nightclub than it is for you to actually oversee the killing of someone with euthanasia in Brisbane. Think about that for a second. The coroner held an inquest into the issue after a man died after taking a voluntary assisted dying substance intended for someone else. So in other words, someone else was prescribed the lethal dosage, the poison to kill them, and a completely different person was able to use it. No checks, no balances. In April 2023, an elderly couple had a euthanasia substance sent to their house. It arrived the same day the person for whom it was intended became seriously unwell with COVID-19 and was unable to swallow it. The VAD drug was subsequently administered at a hospital instead. But the patient's contact person, who was the surviving member of the couple, was not required by law to immediately hand back the other euthanasia substance, even though there was no longer a legitimate reason to need it. So in other words, the drugs arrive, the person who dies is killed by a different set of drugs in the hospital, and this drug that was couriered to people is still out there in the community. He subsequently used it to end his own life on the 16th of May 2023. The coroner said the contact person had been seriously depressed but had stopped undertaking treatment while his partner passed away. So this is a clear case of someone, no illness. This is someone who's suicidal. And this is once again another abject failure of legalised euthanasia. You blur the boundaries now between actually fighting for the lives of depressed people and encouraging them when they don't think their life has any value by actually helping them to end their own lives. Many details about the couple cannot be published for legal reasons. O'Connell said he was not passing judgment on VAD itself, simply the way it was regulated. He highlighted the decision to permit self-administration without the presence of a medical professional. Why does it need to be a medical professional? This is not medicine that's happening here, by the way. It's not. There's no cure, there's no caring, there's no relieving symptoms, there's no trying to bring sort of equilibrium to a person's life or enabling them to have a gentle, level of sort of medical care and support as they die naturally. This is making a person dead. This is ending the life, deliberate ending of life. It's not medicine. You could have a lawyer present. You could have a police officer present. Doesn't need to be a doctor. The reason why they always want to involve the medical profession, though, is because it gives a veneer of respectability to what's going on. It's a very dystopian, it is a very sort of euphemistic way of cloaking the reality of what's actually going on here. That decision came on the advice of the Queensland Law Reform Commission, but against the advice of VAD experts, Professors Ben White and Lindy Wilmot, who recommended requiring the presence of a health professional. The legislation was passed in September 2021. It allows for the euthanasia drugs to be issued to a patient for use within a 12-month period. Even that's highly questionable. A 12-month window you've got. You can have these drugs sitting around for that long. Now, forget about a case like this. What about someone who just stumbles across and discovers these drugs in someone else's home and decides to just take them and use them for themselves? O'Connell found the government had made the wrong choice. He said the laws overwhelmingly favoured patient autonomy, and this had led to an outcome which has caused very significant distress to the family, and a life has been unnecessarily lost. This is a classic example of why the liberal vision of reality is so socially destructive. Because what it does is it fails to respect and operate within the natural law reality that human persons are communal in nature, that we live and act and have our being within community. And therefore this whole idea of a level of autonomy that is so great that you could create this legal fantasy, the sociological alternate reality where you're saying, well, people can just personally euthanize themselves and it has no effect on the rest of the community. It's just utter nonsense, as this case clearly proves. He recommended the laws to be changed so that a health worker should always be present at any administering of a VAD drug. Under the legislation, there were also no checks on whether a contact person had a criminal record or history of mental health problems. Think about that for a second. They don't check for whether or not the contact person had a criminal record or history of mental health problems. There was no screening of any sort, O'Connell found. There were also no checks on storage of the drug, which is designed to cause death. It could legally be kept on a kitchen counter, O'Connell found. So in other words, just sitting there out in the open for anyone to find and use, or perhaps even for a child or someone else to inadvertently take without realising what they were taking and then kill themselves. The evidence of the inquest from a doctor with Queensland VAD, that's the Queensland Voluntary Assisted Dying, was that there had already been a number of near misses. I'm not surprised by that. I mean, is anybody surprised by that? If this is how sloppy things are, this is what happens when liberal euthanasia activists get their way and get involved in lawmaking. We've got a similar problem in New Zealand. It's not quite this bad. We've got other deficiencies in our law, but it's the same pattern everywhere. Liberals who have this obsession, a completely disordered obsession with personal autonomy that is so discordant with reality, end up creating laws that do great harm in the wider community. The Health Minister, Shannon Fentiman, said the state government would consider the coroner's recommendations and would review the legislation. Well, I would humbly suggest that that's probably the least that they can and should be doing in this situation, a truly shocking state of affairs. And while we're speaking about a shocking state of affairs and staying with Australia and the situation there, I want to bring to your attention another coroner's report. This is from the Victorian coroner, and this is from December last year, 2024. And this one is the complete opposite. It's not a warning. It's what you might call a form of official bureaucratic activism. You've heard people probably talk about judicial activism. This is where judges engage in activism to actually reinterpret or try and change laws based on ideology rather than just enforcing them. While this is a similar type of thing with the Victorian coroner and what he has said in this press release that has been issued in response to a euthanasia case that happened there. Let me read this to you. It's an example of officialdom trying to force the hand of the government to actually expand their euthanasia to make it even more liberal than what it already is. Let's read this coroner's press release from last December. Victorian coroner comments on eligibility criteria for voluntary assisted dying. In a finding released today, the suicide death of an 82-year-old man has prompted Victorian coroner Simon McGregor to comment on the eligibility requirements to access voluntary assisted dying in Victoria. The findings follow a coronial investigation into the death of Geoffrey McConaughey, I think that's how you might say that, McConaughey, who was found deceased in his home in September 2023. In late 2022, while visiting family in Switzerland, Mr. McConaughey suffered a stroke that profoundly affected his mental and physical well-being, resulting in a serious depressive illness. So, just so we're clear here, this man experiences a typical thing for older people to have, which is a stroke, and then that goes into a state of depressive illness. And you can see from his symptoms here, clearly he is in depression. After the incident, Mr. McConaughey showed a significantly decreased interest in things he previously enjoyed, openly spoke about suicide with his family, and expressed interest in accessing euthanasia. On the 18th of September 2023, Mr. McConaughey failed to answer his door or respond to phone calls and texts from his sons. A family friend with a spare key then accompanied one of Mr. McConaughey's sons to his address, and on entering the property, they found Mr. McConaughey deceased in his bed. Under the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act 2017, strict eligibility criteria to access euthanasia are set out. A person seeking euthanasia in Victoria must have an incurable, advanced and progressive disease, be experiencing intolerable suffering that cannot be relieved satisfactorily, and the disease is expected to cause death within 6 or 12 months, depending on the circumstances. Despite his physical and mental decline following the stroke, Mr. McConaughey would not have met these eligibility requirements. So this is quite key before we get into what happens next with this shocking piece of coronial activism that you're about to read. This man was not suffering from an incurable, advanced and progressive disease. He was not experiencing intolerable suffering that cannot be relieved satisfactorily, and the disease was not expected to be the cause of his death within 6 or 12 months. So that's the circumstance, and keep that in mind as you read what the coroner does next in this particular case. As part of his investigation, Coroner McGregor reviewed previous coronial findings relating to the scope of eligibility to access euthanasia under the Act, so how liberal it is and who can actually use it. 8 cases were identified where the deceased died by suicide after applying for access to euthanasia and failed to meet the eligibility requirements. A 9th case was identified in which the coroner was unable to determine the deceased's intent. However, suicide was a possibility. I hate to say it, but this sounds an awful lot to me like a pro-euthanasia activist who also happens to be a coroner who then went looking for cases to try and bolster the activism you're about to read about here. His Honour noted that the impact of euthanasia refusal on the deceased was significant in these cases, observing that when people believed they would have access to voluntary assisted dying, they maintained hope that they would be able to exercise control over how they died. When their access to voluntary assisted dying was refused, their consequent despair and frustration contributed to their decision to take their own life. So what he's arguing here is the fact that these people who want to take their own life, because in this case, this man was depressed, because they're told, no, we're not going to help you, a depressed person who doesn't meet the criteria to kill yourself, that actually makes them kill themselves, and this is a bad thing. It's just perverse, this absolutely vicious and perverse circular logic that's being applied here. Given the gravity of decision-making around euthanasia, the care taken by the Victorian government in developing the governing legislation and the necessity for strict eligibility criteria to access the service, Coroner McGregor decided not to make prescriptive recommendations in this matter. And so you think, oh, okay, he's not making recommendations. However, His Honour directed the finding to the Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board and commented that it may form part of a body of evidence to identify opportunities to improve the operation of euthanasia in the state, particularly in quote-unquote areas where the voluntary assisted dying process in Victoria falls short of meeting the expectations of Victorians, well, not all Victorians quite clearly, just those minority who want to do this to themselves, who are experiencing irreversible decline in their health and wish to exercise choice over the timing and manner of their deaths. So in other words, after saying, I'm not going to make any recommendations, he's effectively made a de facto recommendation. This is absolutely officialdom pressuring the government to liberalise their euthanasia law. And it is absolutely shocking when you consider the circumstances of this case. A man who was not terminally ill, who did not have any of the criteria that you heard listed before, and who was experiencing depression, and this coroner is effectively arguing that it would be a good thing to allow someone like that the possibility to end their own life. This is truly shocking. It is very typical of euthanasia run amok, and sadly, we can expect to see more of this wherever you have legalised euthanasia. Effectively, you have two things that come together at once that are absolutely disastrous. You have liberalism and its extremes, and the way in which that autonomy doctrine leads to great societal selfishness and impacts upon vulnerable people. The powerful get to do what they want regardless. And then you also have market forces. You have a growing healthcare need in the over 65 aged demographic. And that's normal. People over the age of 65 have always required the greatest amount of healthcare. That's what happens to the human person as they age. That's a good thing. We should care for them. But what that means is the burden is growing. There are less young people coming into the system because we haven't had enough kids and we've aborted far too many of the ones that we have had. And as a result, there are not enough new, young taxpayers coming into the system to help keep and maintain the existing standard that we've had. And so market forces come to bear here, and euthanasia becomes a very, very effective cost-saving tool for liberal governments. This is the worst of all possible dystopian outcomes, and sadly it is now rife and taking hold all over the West, and it's going to be one of those things that will be looked back upon once the history of the final end of the West is written, and people will look to moments like this, and they will rightly, history will record it as one of the aspects of collapse and decline, the the undermining and the sort of fruit of a collapse of an ideology that lost sight of goodness, truth and beauty and instead wrought destruction upon people in Western nations. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth and beauty, not by lies, and also make sure that you show care, love and community to the vulnerable people around you to protect them from this madness. See you next time on The Dispatches.